to yet another edition of The Verdict. This is a governance program that comes on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. We discuss a number of pertinent issues surrounding the electoral process. And on the program today, we are privileged to host the Disability Rights Watch National Coordinator, and this is none other than Mr. Bruce CHOMA. Our topic of discussion today is disability issues and elections. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you very much, and greetings to our viewers out there.
Thank you. What is the role of the Disability Rights Watch in as far as elections are concerned?
Thank you, Patrick. The Disability Rights Watch is a human rights organization. We are working in the governance and advocacy space to promote the rights of people with disabilities. The issue of political and civic participation is one of the core areas that we try to address in our programs. And we have been working since our formation in 2011 with the other stakeholders in civil society and government itself to champion a more inclusive and accessible electoral process. As many Zambians by now may be aware, the disability community in 2011 did take the Electoral Commission of Zambia to court for the fact that they were running a very inaccessible electoral system that disadvantaged people with disabilities. And the judgment of that matter came in favor of people with disabilities, and the Electoral Commission was ordered to make very specific interventions to ensure that the electoral process is accessible to people with disabilities from 2011 onwards. And we saw a number of reforms, including the fact that there was need for the Electoral Commission of Zambia to deliberately produce an action plan and a budget that addresses the areas of concern for people with disabilities. As an organization in 2015, prior to the by-election that happened after the demise of our late president, we did engage aggressively with the ECZ to ensure that in that election there would be measures to address the judgment of 2011. And we compelled them to produce an action plan and budget for the 2016 general elections. And we saw that happening to the extent that in 2015, for instance, the ECZ pre-tested for the first time the Braille ballot jacket, to allow people with the visual impairments and those who are blind to actually independently cast a ballot without assistance, as provided for, because as you know, all citizens are entitled to a secret ballot. So we have been working with stakeholders to advocate for those reforms, including issues of physical access to the electoral process. One of the orders that the High Court made was that the ECZ needed to ensure that all polling stations were brought to the ground floor, so that people with disabilities who have physical disabilities do not have to climb stairs to go and cast a ballot. And that was implemented. And also there was need to ensure that there were ramps erected in polling stations. Of course, the argument from the operational standpoint of the ECZ was that they don't own the polling facilities, because as we know, in every election, the ECZ goes to use schools, they use churches, many public buildings, which they do not own and operate themselves. So it was a bit of a challenge for them. But with the minimal resources they accessed, some schools were able to erect permanent ramps, which is even better, because beyond an election, those facilities remain still available for other people with disabilities to use as they access those services. But I think that from our perspective as Disability Rights Watch, the 2021 general election is a very important election for the disability community, because it should be able to demonstrate the progress we have made in terms of ensuring that the reforms at ECZ and the attitudes of the political players begin to address the needs of people with disabilities. In 2012, we enacted the Disability Act, which implemented and domesticated the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And it will be 10 years next year. So it is a very important milestone for us to judge our progress as a country in terms of what we are doing to promote the political rights of people with disabilities. Yeah.
Just on that subject, we just want to find out there is also issues of persons with mental disabilities. And at some point we had you steer advocacy in that area. Did you won the fight in terms of ensuring that persons with intellectual disabilities and mental issues are equally, their rights are equally respected in as far as the electoral process is concerned?
Of course, the domestication of the UN Convention paved way for our laws to begin to do away with the issues of unsound mind. And we saw in the 2016 amendment of the Constitution that the description of people of unsound mind has been done away with in the Constitution. The Electoral Process Act and all the other legislations must now also follow suit. In 2019, we pushed for the enactment of the Mental Health Act, which is now law. And of course, the Mental Health Act in Section 4 has a provision for legally disqualified persons. This means that there are people who are deemed incapable of making decisions. And I think that some of the wording there is being imported into the Electoral Process Act. We've been following the discussions when it came up for amendment to the floor of the House. And explicitly speaking, the Constitution does not facilitate for discrimination on the basis of mental disability. But our electoral processes are yet to align fully to that realization. But from our standpoint, in terms of the practical steps taken by the ECZ, you will note that it is not a requirement for somebody to declare their mental health condition prior to registration as voters. So if one has a manageable mental health condition, they would be allowed to register as voters without discrimination. But it's important that the law is very specific to the fact that regardless of one's mental health history, they should not be disadvantaged, especially when it comes to the issue of candidature. It is a bit easier on the side of being voters, but when it comes to the issue of being aspiring for public office, oftentimes our colleagues in politics and other institutions want to fall back on the legally disqualified clause to begin to argue that what if somebody gets into a relapse and they are not able to adhere to their treatment, or something happens to them, they swing to the other side. You know, if it's bipolar or schizophrenia, whichever condition it is, they want to raise that against them in terms of going to hold public office and other decision-making bodies. But we feel that it's important for our laws and our systems to recognize the fact that people with mental disabilities have got the same rights as every other person, and they should enjoy what is called the right to legal capacity. And I think the Mental Health Act is very clear that people with mental disabilities have got the right to exercise their legal capacity. It even provides for assisted measures where if somebody has a mental health problem that requires assistance periodically, they will be able to appoint somebody to support them to be able to function. So at that level of progress, we should not be able to continue discriminating people with mental disabilities from participating in the political process of the country.
That's an interesting law you are talking about there, which talks about the mental health law. Now that we have that good law legislation in place, implementation also is another issue that as a country we have been grappling with. How can we work around towards ensuring that this important piece of legislation is equally well implemented?
Yes, the implementation of laws calls for a couple of things. One of them is policy harmonization. You need to ensure that government policies speak to each other. The health policy, the policies to do with mental health in particular, policies to do with social protection, and also policies to do with governance space must also speak to each other. Legislation that borders on political participation, such as the Electoral Process Act and other laws, must begin to align with the aspirations of human rights standards that are in the Mental Health Act and the Disabilities Act. So that harmonization requires a lot of stakeholder engagement, but also it requires a shift in the thinking of the policymakers so that they begin to appreciate that the issue of participation of people with disabilities is a cross-cutting issue. The Mental Health Act itself is not just a health act, actually it's a human rights instrument. It has human rights things that are inbuilt there that speak to the right to participate in systems and processes. It speaks to the correctional facilities, how they should treat people with mental health problems when they go into incarceration. It speaks to the procedures to be followed by prosecution officers when they go into conflict with the law. So it has got multiple dimensions, and we must begin to address these things from a broader perspective. And I think that, like you have correctly said, one of the challenges we've had as a country generally is our slow pace of implementation. We are very good at crafting well-written legislation, but aligning our practices in institutions to those laws is a challenge. And I think it requires us to demonstrate a higher level of political will, but also put the resources in the right places. And acts like the Mental Health Act, Disability Act, they require that the ministers responsible for those acts proactively issue regulations. You've seen other, like if you look at the Ministry of Finance, for instance, they're always issuing regulations around taxes, with the budget alignment. All those are things meant to operationalize, fiscal policies and legislation. Exactly. But when it comes to social sectors, political sectors, having regulations in place is always a challenge. Even, for instance, the matter we're talking about here of political participation, we have been grappling with the Political Parties Act, which hasn't come into place up to now. But you see that the 2016 Constitutional Amendment had put into effect the need for us to have public funding for political parties. But we have not moved on that score because of these same things we're talking about, lack of commitment to the process, but also failure to build consensus among stakeholders on what we actually should be doing. And as we are having these push and pull processes, the people who are supposed to benefit from the law, like those who are disadvantaged, the vulnerable, the poor, end up not having the services they need because people who are responsible for doing something about them are not in harmony.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, our viewers, we are discussing disability issues and elections, and our guest on the program is the Disability Rights Watch National Coordinator, none other than Mr. Bruce CHOMA. Well, Mr. CHOMA, we just want to get your perspective, getting into the electoral process. We saw the ECZ start commence the voter registration exercise. Now we'd like to find out how would you rate the mainstreaming of disability issues in that important process in particular.
Thank you, Patrick. The voter registration exercise had a number of challenges, but from our perspective at Disability Rights Watch, we were not satisfied by, one, the amount of time allocated to the process. Secondly, we were dissatisfied by the support measures that were absent for people with disabilities. Many of the centers where the registration was taking place were not physically accessible to people with disabilities. We raised this concern consistently, and we were hoping that there would have been accommodations in terms of dedication of particular accessible polling stations, registration centers, specifically for people with disabilities to be able to easily go and register. And we didn't see, from the conduct of those doing the registration, an actual understanding of what disability is and how to manage people with disabilities. The other concern we raised around the voter registration process was the categorization of people with disabilities in the input process. We saw that the ECZ designed a registration tool which for the first time carries disability data. This is commendable, and I think it's the biggest plus for us as a sector, because the challenge we had in previous elections was that the ECZ did not know how many people with disabilities needed to access electoral services. They didn't know where to find the various impairment categories in the polling station. So there are difficulties locating the right personnel and locating the right support materials. For instance, we talked about the Braille jacket earlier on. You need to be able to know where you can find a blind voter who has the capacity to read Braille and give them that particular voting instrument. In addition to that, the person who is handling that person in the polling station must also have received orientation in terms of how they should support the visually impaired person to cast their independent ballot. So those are the issues that became a challenge. So if you looked at the choices that came as you are registering as a voter, they were asking disability categories that were inconsistent with what we call the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning. When you're looking at disability, you're looking at functional domains. There are basically 6. So you need to ask people those functional domains as they affect their interaction with the electoral process.
Exactly.
But we're asking things like, can you use your left hand? Can you use your right hand? So the questions we're asking might make it a bit difficult to correctly categorize people with disabilities. But it's a starting point. And we think that our advocacy now has been, can the ECZ now give us that information? How many people with disabilities have actually been captured on the system? And in what impairment categories?
Exactly.
And so that we are able to begin to also, as civil society, begin to come in to provide the technical support, but also to provide awareness to all our members, because most of the people with disabilities belong to associations of people with disabilities. And at this point, the ECZ must already begin to avail that data so that they can begin to mobilize awareness for their members and begin to also ensure that they engage with the ECZ if more meaningfully towards resource allocation, because we know that one of the challenges ECZ faces is finances, and generally for the entire country resources are limited, and so those who speak louder have a higher chance of getting the support they need. And we look at the time frame remaining, we're not going towards the printing of the ballot papers. We should already begin to ask ourselves how many Braille jackets we're going to print, how many other support equipment and materials are we going to require for people with disabilities? Because it goes beyond just the Braille. It's also other categories. There are people who've got low vision. They might require maybe a bigger font for their ballot papers. I don't know if there are issues like lighting in those polling stations where people need to be able to have adequate light. Those who have got low vision, Are we going to have handheld magnifiers for people who, like, for those with albinism who might need to magnify and read the text, which is small, to avoid, identifying the ballot paper to the person who cast a vote? That's the challenge we have, because you can't create a ballot paper specifically for a person with disability. Because the result of doing that is that then you are going to have voter tracing. We don't want a situation whereby you're able to tell who cast what vote. Then it defeats the whole essence of a secret ballot. So you must provide mechanisms to allow for somebody who has got low vision to get a handheld magnifier, for instance, and magnify the text and put their X where they want to put it. You must also have a mechanism for a person visually impaired to be able to read using Braille and choose a candidate of their choice.
Exactly.
In 2016, the problem we had was the Braille jacket only catered for the presidential ballots.
Oh.
It didn't cater for the other. It didn't cater for the referendum. It didn't cater for the parliamentary. It didn't cater for the councillors. So at the end of the day, it came back to the same thing. They still had to get help from other people to be able to mark those ballots. But even the presidential ballot one didn't have the names of candidates. It only had candidate 1, candidate 2, up to candidate 8, I think. So the problem there again was that you still have to ask someone, so who is candidate 1? Okay, who is candidate 2? They still have to read them to you. Then you go there and begin to choose and make the mark. So we have to make those improvements to see to it that as far as practical, we can begin to allow for an independent vote. Our friends in other countries, even in countries as close as Namibia, have already explored electronic voting. And I think that one of the advantages of ICTs is that it's more inclusive of people with disabilities. Because if you look at voting procedures like in the USA, where you're able to put your headphones into the polling machine, it's able to literally speak to you as a blind person, and you can hear the things in your headphone. You just click there. If it's 1, you click. If it's 2, then you cast your ballot for you, and your ballot goes. So you don't have to worry about.
We hope that we reach those levels
of course,
very soon.
I mean, one of the fundamental challenges in our governance space, unfortunately, is that we have a lot of distrust for institutions. I think the ECZ has made efforts before to begin to radicalize and transform the process, but the allegations of rigging that arise, political parties themselves are suspicious of the ruling party and the government. So it becomes slow in terms of.
But how do we collectively build that confidence in the ECZ?
The solution to building confidence in the ECZ is that we must promote a culture of transparency and consistent engagement. One of the problems we've had, even engaging with ECZ ourselves, the civil society, has been that there's been a lot of rigidity in terms of consultations, because decisions are sometimes made and then they are communicated to stakeholders without adequate consultations. We feel that the electoral cycle is an ongoing process. We must not sit back and wait for 4 years to pass, then we begin talking about an election. We should have already been picking up lessons from 2016 and continuously begin to improve our process. Even the issue of voter registration should have been ongoing. That has always been our argument as civil society, that we don't need to stop. As much as possible, people are growing older, more voters are coming on stream, there should be a mechanism to capture them, so that as the elections draws nearer, we don't have to begin to have challenges like we've seen, NRCs, voters' cards, and now even voter verification is a challenge. For our constituency in particular, you saw that ECZ was using a lot of online methods now, which were to a very high extent inaccessible to people with disabilities in various categories. And also the fact that most of our people with disabilities live in very poor conditions, and most of them are in rural areas. So when it comes to the digital divide, they are literally cut off, and we must begin to think about ways of ensuring that they are not excluded as we are making these reforms.
Just on the same issue, but on another perspective, we look at the voter verification, which was recently held, and it was also done online and also as well as physically. But the voter apathy, the process was also was marred by apathy, and that has been the concern of many stakeholders. We just want to get also your perspective regarding that process. Do you feel we also did enough to ensure that persons with disabilities were given enough opportunity to equally verify?
I think the process followed in the verification was not very different from the process followed in the actual registration. And the support measures for people with disabilities were not in place. And secondly, we didn't see targeted awareness towards people with disabilities. Ideally, when you're going through a process as significant as that, you need to ensure that you work with organizations of people with disabilities, especially in the rural areas, to go forth and inform their members to come out and verify their details. That robust awareness was not there, and there was also little understanding about if there are consequences of not verifying or not. You know, what would happen to you if you don't verify your details, or if you don't actually undergo that process, how would you be disadvantaged during the voting process? So we didn't do enough awareness. The time allocated was also inadequate, and we feel that for people with disabilities, there are still a lot of barriers, such as long distances, such as the attitudes of people who do these processes, and generally the fact that there's the same fatigue that a lot of Zambians feel when it comes to governance and elections is also beginning to affect people with disabilities. Because remember, elections are a governance process, and they are about choosing leaders that inspire confidence in you. So if Zambians generally begin to demonstrate apathy towards the electoral process, it means that even people with disabilities will also have the similar or worse apathy, because they must see a connection between their quality of life and the leaders that they choose. And so if they don't appreciate the importance and the connection of that, it becomes very difficult to inspire people with disabilities to take the effort to undergo this process. Because in many instances, people with disabilities, the cost of just doing a process as easy as verification is maybe sometimes twice or 3 times more than for a non-disabled person. So if you're a blind person and you're thinking about going to look for food for yourself and for your family, and now I've been told to go and line up to verify your voters' details, if you are going to get on a bus, obviously you're paying double. You're paying for yourself, and you're paying for the person who is escorting you to guide you on the way. So the cost for doing that for us who don't have a disability might be maybe 10 kwacha to go to Civic Center, but somebody who has a disability might pay maybe 25 kwacha. So the cost is becoming 2 to 3 times more. So the incentive to do that is diminished in the absence of inspiration. So I think it's a challenge to our political players and government in particular to begin to raise awareness on the civic responsibilities that all citizens have to support these processes, and that they should see a connection between their lives and the outcome of an election.
Just now we'll also break, and we'll also play a clip of persons with disabilities highlighting issues that are affecting them in various sectors, so that we can get to appreciate their views on this subject of discussion. And remember, we are discussing elections and disability. And just now we'll take a break, and we'll continue with the topic of discussion on the other side.
We therefore call upon the government through the Minister of Youth and Sport to implement immediate measures to address the plight of youths with disabilities, to enable them to participate in the society on an equal basis with those without disabilities. We demand that Zambia take serious steps to ensure that it includes youths with disabilities in the Youth Empowerment Fund. Without swift action by government, youths with disabilities are condemned to a life of poverty and may end up on the street as beggars.
We are being left behind. So let us stop singing this song if we're not walking our talk as a country. And to tell you the truth, Zambia is called as a Christian nation. Is that what Christianity means? Let us not insult persons with disabilities by issuing statements that are injuring to them. We are being injured as persons with disabilities, and we simply need what we deserve. What we deserve. We deserve to be treated well. We deserve quality education, quality health, equal opportunities in terms of employment, so that we can have the buying power and not suffer from these other issues like malnutrition that may cause disabilities at the end of it all.
The nomination fees that have been reduced by the Electoral Commission of Zambia do not specifically state the reduction that differently abled presidential candidates and members of parliament will be able to pay ahead of the forthcoming August 12 general elections.
Holland Disabled Association
in the outcomes of the these national level elections by major political parties in Zambia is that there is very little space for people with disabilities to access decision-making structures of political parties. We have seen a continued